I've never shared this with anybody publicly. There's so many things happening in this conversation right now. 1,000 years from now, people are going to be looking at this podcast saying, so this was the breakthrough.
If this was Sports Center, that would be like such a hot take. Skip Bayless would have no idea. Stephen A. Smith would have no idea what to say if you drop that down. That is so good.
Yeah, this is my third bottle. So I misunderstood the instructions and the premise of the podcast interview.
The joke I always say is like, how'd you learn so much? Got to drink a lot.
The power of food and beverage to lubricate an environment.
Resistance to change is hurting the church.
I'm not in the camp that God has a penis or a vagina or a body at all. I'm in the camp that God is a universal spirit.
This is the strangest podcast that I've been on. I don't even know what to do.
I'm kind of geeked up about this wine.
You've uncovered the mystery. You've exposed the formula.
You've just duct taped together a number of things that aren't normally hanging out together, and I'm here for it.
We're going to sit down at a table, we're going to have a glass of wine and some food, and we're going to talk about the beauty of Jesus.
Thank you for the hospitality that this particular podcast provides folks like myself, and I know others, to be curious around their faith practices.
I will never forget the first time I bought a bottle of wine by myself, which was yesterday.
If you're familiar with drunk history, I thought it's like drunk theology. So
By the way, drinking this Pinot Grigio at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is making me even more direct in my communication than I normally would be.
Well, it's time for episode 17 of Cabernet and Pray. Today we're talking with a philosophy professor named Mike Austin. And this is fun because I love philosophy. And I don't know if you get into much philosophy, but I like to read a lot about Stoicism. And to me, one of the premises that I operate in, and you're going to hear this mentioned in this episode, is that all truth is God's truth. So if you find truth in somewhere outside of Christian circles or an overtly Christian place, it can still be true if it's true, right? So if it lines up with who God is and what reality is, no matter where you find it, it's truth. All truth is God's truth. And I encourage you to keep that in mind as you listen to today's episode, because we're going to explore not only the practical sides of Christianity and how to follow Jesus, but also throw in some philosophy there as well. And I think it's super cool. Today, we're looking at Mike Austin. He's the foundation professor of philosophy at Eastern Kentucky University. He is the current president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. So cool. He's the senior fellow of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. Mike has published 12 books. His writing and research is focused on character development and spiritual formation. His latest book is called Humility: Rediscovering the Way of Love and Life in Christ. And this is the book we get into in the podcast today. I think you're going to love Mike's practical way of getting into the nitty-gritty. What does it mean for us to look more like Jesus? Enjoy episode 17. All right. Well, as we begin our discussion, that sound means it's time to talk about what we're drinking today. I'll go first, and then we'll see what Mike's got on tap. I'm drinking, I'm just attempt this, Chateau Le Hospitalet. This is a French bottle. Looks awesome. I don't know if that's how you say it. This is a GSM blend from France, which means you got mainly Syrah with some Grenache and Mourvedre. As I am enjoying this so far, I'm getting blackberry, red licorice, and then this is a hearty wine, so I'm getting some leather, and then I wrote potting soil, which is just what I'm getting. And I realize sometimes when we talk about these wine flavors, people are like, that doesn't sound appealing. But that's the fun of wine, is you get all sorts of weird, funky flavors in it. So that's what I'm drinking. Mike, what are you drinking today?
Yeah, I'm drinking, and it looks like the bottle's downstairs. It looks like Cheneau, but because I'm in Richmond, Kentucky, it's Chenault Vineyards Cabernet Franc, I believe it is. And I haven't had it yet.
Okay, we got to get your official opinion on it.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I got it because it's local wine, so it's a local winery. And yeah, it's a local winery. I mean, I'm not a big connoisseur of wine. Like, I can tell the difference between $2 Chuck from Trader Joe's and something that is better. But yeah, it's good. It's dry. I like dry red wines. I don't like sweet wines, so I'm good.
Nice. I appreciate the Cab Franc. I am a huge Cab Franc fan, and I have a very hard time getting my friends to enjoy Cab Franc. The other day, we had Cabernet Sauvignon. We were sharing it, and there's 4 of us, and everyone was loving it. And so, like, hey, let's get another bottle. You want a second glass? And I'm like, all right. And I'm like, this is the setup for the Cab Franc. They're gonna love it, and it didn't go over as well. So, cheers to you for pulling out the Cab Franc. I like that move a lot. Well, I had a chance to read your latest book called Humility. The subtitle is Rediscovering the Way of Love and Life in Christ. And what I would say to our podcast listeners and those watching, this is like a great how-to manual of like how to actually look more like Jesus. Like we talk a lot about some abstract ideas, and sometimes I think we get lost on like, what am I actually supposed to do? Like, how do I actually look more like Jesus? I think Mike's doing a great job. We're going to dive into that a little bit in our conversation. But before we do, there's a question I often like to ask people. I'd love to hear your answer to this. As a professor of philosophy, that's a fun niche you're in. How has your faith changed over the last 10 years?
10 years. That's a good question. I think like I've never been too worried about the philosophical problems that people raise for belief in God. I would say though the way my faith has changed, and I know I don't look it, but I'm 54. Actually, I'm only saying that because a drunk guy in New Orleans a couple weeks ago was shocked, which would normally feed my ego, but because of the drunk guy in New Orleans, it didn't really do much for me beyond the first second. But yeah, I think for me, and the reason I bring that up is like when I was 25 or even 35, I think I had more convictions than I do now. So I have more beliefs now. Like I've got more opinions about things, more beliefs, but philosophers, we like to be sort of picky about opinions, beliefs, convictions, kind of the difference of those things. And I think most people kind of understand what that difference would be. So fewer convictions, but the ones I have are just, I would say they're deeper, kind of go all the way down. And so that's the way my faith has changed, and that there are some things. And so when I see something, this is part of the impetus for the book, when I see things in myself and in others that don't line up with those kind of core basic convictions, I just think, then I get motivated, right, to do something, whether it's in my life or to speak or to pray or to, sometimes it just means go have a glass of wine because I can't do anything about it. But that's, so that's the thing that jumps to mind for me. Because so many, it's not news to people the way so much, whether it's online or in real life, so many people, they seem to have convictions about everything. And anything they think about, if they've got even just an opinion, then they're convinced of it all the way down.
Right. It's a very deep conviction, all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm always amazed how often, if you were to ask Christians, like, what do you think the essentials of Christianity is? More than what we would come up with, I'm more intrigued with how many are on your list. Like are there 8? Are there 20? Are there 100? Because that kind of shows you the scope again of how you are holding your beliefs and how you make sense of them. And truly, they become a line then that everybody has to cross. How many of your beliefs do other people have to agree with in order for you to say, yeah, you're welcome in here? Versus, hey, we see the core, the same, versus a number of these other topics. So I love that. All right, a few things. I want to read some quotes that I loved in your book, and I always love when I know that I'm going to interview an author of a book. I read that book with like an extra eagerness because I know anything that stands out to me, anything that's interesting, I get to ask you about. So right out of the gate, the thing that just jumped out at me is you said this, and I quote, "I think alcohol can be a good thing received with gratitude from the hand of God."
Cheers. There you go. That's right. I didn't even know it was going to be in this podcast then, but it was written just with this hour in mind.
I don't even have a question with that. I just wanted to celebrate that you wrote that line in the book, and then we get to talk about the book with alcohol. So that's fun.
That's right. I was talking to a friend of mine actually about that, and we were talking about this, and I thought, I almost took it out because it's not like it fits in the flow of the chapter. It's not a big deal. But it's something we noticed. Like I grew up in Kansas City. We live in LA, Boulder, Colorado, and then you move to the South, and there is this sort of weird among a lot of Christians here thing about alcohol that was just not totally new to me, but just how prevalent it was and how big deal. People get worried if you drink a beer, but you can, violate 7 or 8 other like actual commands in the Bible, and it's all right. So, anyway, yeah, one of those little soapboxes for me, because that's one of my convictions. Let's not make up rules, things that aren't there, and that would be one.
Well, Mike, we join you in that one. We applaud that.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, another thing you say is the goal of discipleship is not intellectual certainty or moral perfection. It is union with God. God isn't waiting for us to become morally perfect so we can be united to him. He offers that union to us now, just as we are. But union with God is itself morally transformative. As we go further up and deeper in, we will be changed. Love this idea. What does this look like in your experience?
Yeah, and I think there's an element of, as I mentioned in one of the chapters, like several different spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines or whatever people want to call them. Those are things that we can do. But I think we should view those things as a means to, I want to say like cultivating or deepening our union with God. And I think that's true, but also it's God has to do something. Like it's kind of like with my wife, or with, you can, when we were engaged, read a book like about preparing to get married, and then you get married and you realize, oh yeah, I'm married to a person, not to like somebody that responds to some manual. You do these things and your wife will be happy, or whatever it is, And so I think the same thing with God. There's some mystery there. And I think in my mind, I'm thinking a lot of people think of Christianity maybe as a moral self-help or self-improvement project, but a lot more people think about union with God and having like a religious experience, or a deeper spiritual experience, which I'm all for because it's a relationship. But I don't think you can separate those two things out. Like I think to be more deeply united to God over time means I'm becoming more like Christ, and having those intellectual and moral virtues. This is something you can find from not just the Bible, but the ancient Greeks and others. They actually, having those kind of traits helps me see and understand reality more fully, more deeply, more accurately. And so I think the same thing applies with God. So the mystery there is it's great. God's grace. I can do all the quote unquote right things, and maybe God is, as the Bible talks about, God hides from us sometimes. He's got some other thing in mind. But yeah, it's that I want to move away from let's just do these things so we can have this experience of God for the experience sake. Because you might not feel close to God, and you might be closer to God, or I might be closer to God in those moments than when I feel like I am. It's just like with my wife. We might be really close in the moment of conflict because there's actual kind of, I was going to say brutal honesty. And sometimes it's like that, just a more bare, open honesty between each other. That doesn't always feel good. So those are kind of things I had in mind. And that's really the big picture of the book, that humility is one of those traits that are central in how we relate to God and others, but that he doesn't.
Someone looks at that and goes, I love that idea, right? Okay, I want that. How do you have union with a God you can't see, you can't hear, you can't touch? What have you learned in your journey of following Jesus that's helpful in that regard?
Yeah, that's one of the hard things for sure. And I still, sometimes I'm a philosopher, but I think we all think this thought, at least sometimes. I'll just sit and think, is none of this true? And I'm just going to rot in the ground and be warm food, and it's just going to be the cold, long, dark sleep of death. That's not funny, but for philosophers it is.
It's very philosopher of you. Yes, I love it.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, I think no, I do this in class. I lost my train of thought. What's your question? I haven't had any wine before, right?
This is great. No, so you talk about union with God is itself transformational, and the idea that God's got to do something too. But someone might go, I want it, but I can't see God, I can't hear God, I can't touch God. How do I humbly, right, go before God with that experience? And again, I think this is where your book is offering something tangible to people. These are not just ideas, and you might expect that from someone who spends time in philosophy, but this is very practical. So how do you practically do that with someone you can't see, you can't hear?
Yeah. So I think I think it can be different for each person. I think like certain ways of approaching God, or at least opening ourselves up to God to move, can be different. Like, so for me, I found in recent years, being like times of solitude and just being quiet have been the most helpful, because I just reread the book to remind myself of what I wrote, because it's been a while since I actually wrote it from when it comes out. But yeah, my job and my sort of personality bent, it's so much about words, right? In the classroom, it's saying the right words and grading whether people have the right words or not, and speaking the right words. And when I'm speaking outside of the university setting, thinking the right words, writing the right words in philosophy. And then in this kind of book, it's really a spiritual formation book, not a philosophy book. And so for me, just to like set that aside, just kind of be quiet, that helps. One thing that's really made a difference to me in the past few years, specifically to the God not being physically tangible, is this idea from Bonhoeffer and Life Together, who I talk about a decent amount in the book, is that other believers in my community, my church, they're a physical sign of Christ. Like, that's the way that Christ is actually physically present to me. And I think I'd experienced that before, but having that someone say it that way and think, oh, that's actually correct. I can be with some people I trust that have deeper relationships with, and sometimes just being with them, my outlook changes. And we haven't done anything, that we haven't done a Bible study together necessarily, or all the different things we do. Great, all that stuff's great, but just friendship, right? A deeper kind of friendship, and then I come away encouraged and have a sense that God is real, because I'm around other people and He's present in that group physically, in that believer. So that really, I would say that is one that helps the most. And I think that's important because, right, if you think about the sort of classic spiritual disciplines, the spiritual formation movement of the last 30 years or so, at least in my perspective, I often thought of it as like this sort of, it is monastic and individual, but it's much more than that. And so I kind of had this idea in my mind. I just sit alone in a room and have these incredible epiphanies of God. And that does once in a great while happen.
Wine helps with that too, by the way.
Yeah, that's true. Just don't question the cause, right? Just whatever you get, just be grateful.
Yes,
it's a means of grace. Yeah, actually does help, right? When you're sitting down with other people, wine, or I'm in Kentucky, so some bourbon or whatever it is. But yeah, I think so. That's what's really helped me actually, is just a word of encouragement from others, or just time with other people that God's physically present there. And yeah, look, that's just the nature. Aside from that, though, that's just the nature of, for whatever reason, the way creation is set up at this moment, right? God's not physically present in those ways. And so the closeness comes, I guess I would say this too, maybe one last thing about this, is that we tend to think of communication like we're having right now. So I've got content in my mind that I'm relaying through speech to you, and through that speech you're hearing and interpreting, and we're understanding. So in a way, and people listening, we're transferring ideas in our minds to others in that way. But God's not limited to physical speech to do that, right? God can communicate with us. We can think His thought. He can share His thoughts with us, and by that means, or other ways as well. So I think that's one thing too, just to realize that God's not limited by the physical in that way that we are. And so that can help. God can speak through the Word, through the Spirit, through other people, directly communicate thoughts to us. So anyway, so I guess I'm a mystic in those ways. It always surprises me when people act like mystic is a bad word. And it's not. It's actually a pretty good one. So.
No, and in fact, the older I get, the more I'm drawn to that. As when I was younger, I think it did look kind of weird to me, but you get to a point where you're kind of like, there's got to be more. There's got to be things that go beyond just the senses. But I actually love your definition of how you view other people as the expression of God. And I can't help but think, if churches focus more on that, of hey, here's why being in this community matters so much. Not because you get a star for attendance, or because, you're somehow holier if you're here. It's that, literally you have greater chances of experiencing Jesus in this type of a space because of the believers, and not this, not the building, not the preaching, just, the very fact of believers. I just can't help to think that would be like a lot of people who have, deconstructed, quote unquote, would be like, oh yeah, how do I find communities like that? How do I find spaces like that? And obviously it doesn't have to only happen in a local church context, but when you have people coming together, that is a huge advantage, to see God in that way. So I really think that's a beautiful idea. You say, this is an idea that really jumped out at me. You said, we are not merely followers of the way. We should also be preparers of the way to the way. And this is a really cool idea that we don't hear as much talk about, that not just we're experiencing, but we are preparing the way to the way for other people who have not experienced it. Can you elaborate on this idea? What does it look like to prepare the way for others and do it well?
Yeah. So I think, I became, I guess, an evangelical without knowing it when I was a senior in high school. I kind of grew up in Roman Catholic Church, and kind of like you with sort of the mysticism, and I've come to appreciate the Roman Catholic Christian brothers and sisters more than I did initially, just because my own experience. There's some good and bad about it, but yeah. So I guess I'm bringing it up because initially I was like in the 80s and the 90s, right? So this was sort of that time of evangelicalism in America, and of course that was before you had to qualify what that meant, like I would do today, about 50 different ways to still accept the label. But yeah, I think it just means, it doesn't mean like then where you're just going up to people and sharing the 4 spiritual laws, which I actually did. I was involved with Crew for a while, or kind of having these like big programs, and there's some good in those things. And maybe not so much now compared to even then. I think it was sort of at the end of its usefulness in certain ways, those methods, which, but anyway, I think, so it's not just like, how can I like get some, I think we think of it, people in my generation and kind of our background, it was often like, well, how can I share my faith with somebody? Right. So you befriend people. Now, you not just to share your faith with them, but really that's kind of why you're doing it. I mean, like and now I'd say just be their friend, just to be their friend, right? And love them. And that's actually the way you prepare the way, and you can have conversations. And, people might actually ask you if you've experienced some of this transformation, like I talk about in the book, like people have experienced over the millennia or the centuries in Christ. Like someone might really ask you for the reason that the hope that you have, that 1 Peter 3 verse that people use in apologetics, but in many ways what it's really focused on is character and on who you are. So to me, being a preparer of the way to the way is, especially in our time and our particular culture, it's a lot of it has to do with, well, it's related to deconstruction. It's like a lot of the stuff that people are deconstructing from is stuff that's not really a part of the way of Christ. It's subconsciously, sometimes intentionally imported in, right, to our teaching, our books, the sort of what some people call the evangelical industrial complex, and even more broadly, just American Christianity, right? It can seep into other parts of the Christian church. And so it's trying to get rid of that junk and like help people see who Christ really is, trying to manifest or exemplify these traits of who Christ is. Of course, we're going to fall short because we're human and all jacked up, but I mean, yeah, we can be better. And then the other part of that, I think, is, and this is again stuff from Bonhoeffer, but it just has really gripped me. He talks about, if the poor person who doesn't have bread, right, in your community can't come to Christ and you've got extra, that's, in a certain way, it's your fault, right? So, I mean, because of course they can't see God's faithfulness, because if God's body, right, which is the, Christians in the world, isn't doing what God would have them do, then how are they going to know who God is? And God can work beyond us, but I think that's a big part, right? So it means all these culture war issues instead of being culture war issues, that become like, well, how can I help the 17-year-old girl who's pregnant and doesn't know what to do, and her parents are going to kick her out of the house, or the 20-year-old, gay college student whose parents don't want them to come home for the holidays because they're embarrassed, or because they're kicking them out of the house, or, I mean, all the stuff that people like to make noise about. So it's not luring people or manipulating people emotionally or intellectually, but it's actually just, it's looking at the barriers and trying to walk with people through them and show them that there really is, for me, is using philosophy language, there really is goodness, truth, and beauty in the person of Christ, and all the other stuff. Yeah, I want to throw it away too. And then when you're on the way, right, you're on that path with Jesus, followers of the way, the capital W, like they talk about in Acts, it's humility and love and a bunch of other good stuff too.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, I wanna get into something you reference vaguely, and then you back out of it. So we're gonna go into it because this is what you can do on a podcast.
Yeah, that's right.
In your book, you say this line: "I am not a pacifist, but I'm very close to being one," which I found a very interesting way to phrase that, Mike.
Yeah.
So a little bit of setup for me here on this question. I went from, I was born in Arizona. Grew up in Arizona. This is still the Wild Wild West. We love our guns in Arizona, maybe only second to Texas, perhaps. But I was raised as a gun owner. I owned guns, as a young adult myself. I even went so far as I had my concealed carry permit because I was convinced, I was going to be ready to take down a bad guy with my gun for all of this. And had a moment with one of my mentors where we were working through some teachings of Jesus and just felt like this moment of, I haven't seen this the Jesus way, and did a full 180. And I literally tell a story of I remember where I was when I became a pacifist. I was sitting in a hotel room chair, and I remember just having this conversation with God of I don't really know many pacifists. What does this mean? And what do I do with this? And very scary. Well, that's been, I don't know, 10, 15 years now since I've made that move. And here's what I have found. People are intrigued when I talk about my views of nonviolence and why I get them from Jesus. Very intrigued by it. And usually in an encouraging way, really love that. That's great. Very rarely do people ever say, yes, I want to believe that too. And I want to be a pacifist too. And there's just something that I'm there's some hurdle there. And you wrote a book called God and Guns in America. Haven't had a chance to read that one, but you're also somewhere near a pacifist. I'd love to get, what have you landed on this? How have you worked through it? Are you still a work in progress, or you feel like you've got it dialed in?
Yeah, for sure, work in progress. But yeah, the way that happened was through writing that book. So I grew up outside of Kansas City on the Kansas side, but my dad, we grew up, there was a gun case in our house. It was a safe in later years. At the early years, it was just like a chintzy sort of wood glass case with a little tiny, a lock that really didn't do much. So I was just used to being around guns. My dad's still is, love to trap, skeet, sporting clay. So we would hunt growing up for pheasant and geese, and that's pretty much it. He had some other guns too, and would go to the range, but primarily, is that gun culture, I guess what they sort of call gun culture 1.0, which was about as a sport, as hunting, right? And then gun culture 2.0 became the self-defense kind of armed citizen kind of thing. So for me, I always had those intuitions, like a lot of people, that violence isn't good, but in this world, you just have to, sometimes you need to. So being a just war theorist, right, in warfare, we have to have violence. If you don't fight, then the Hitlers of the world will win, that, which you hear a lot. And yeah, if I kind of came home, and somebody's beating on my children or trying to kill my wife, I'm going to use violence or shoot them. I don't have a gun, but, that I carry, but I never have carried. But yeah, then it was really in the process of writing that book. Sometimes you write a book like the humility one, things that have been marinating in my mind, some of them for 20 years. And you're just I'm just going to finally get a bunch of this stuff out that I think might help people. And it'd be good for me to sort of coalesce my thoughts. The guns book was almost, I had some intuitions, but it was what do I actually think about this stuff? Because I would see people quote Bible verses, usually on the pro gun side of it, so to speak. I was just that doesn't, how did you get from there to there, And so as I started doing the reading people's arguments, looking at scripture more with that question in mind, I say almost a pacifist because I just can't quite just say I am. There's something like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he's been called a conditional pacifist, meaning it's a pacifist, but there could be a few exceptions. So I think that's probably where I am. That might be more accurate. And I'm actually teaching a class, a upper division class in the honors program we have right now called Guns and the Culture of Violence. And so we just read a bunch of pacifist stuff. And as I read it, I feel like I identify, when you're teaching something, some stuff this resonates with me, and you teach other stuff and it doesn't. And so I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because I'm afraid just to say I am, but I'm about as close as you can be and not just accept the label. Because there's just, especially as you just read not just the passage in the Sermon on the Mount, but a lot of other stuff in the New Testament. It's just like, and just the whole picture of the Christian life that we're given. It's really hard to say, yeah, this is justified, or for sure not as justified as many Christians in America think it is, and not as justified as I used to think it was. So, yeah, so I would say I'm still a work in progress, but it wouldn't take much for me just to like take that last little half step over the line. I feel like I'm sort of straddling the line, maybe is the best way to put it, with like half of my foot still in the violence is sometimes permissible camp. But I just was recently thinking about this, just thinking maybe it's just such a hard teaching and I'm just not willing to totally take it yet. But that's something for me to think and pray about. Maybe I should take it. For sure seems much more like the way Christ lived and taught, and the teachings and pictures the way the disciples and the apostles and the early church for sure lived was with that teaching. And it's probably not a coincidence that it became just war theory came on the scene after Constantine and Christianity became allied with politics and violence and those kind of things.
Yeah, well, when you have, the nation's or the country, the world's largest military, you got to justify how you use it. You got to come up with some theologies to explain that. I remember I was in a class. You'll probably appreciate this. For my master's program, it was a class on Bonhoeffer. So the entire class was just on, the writings and the life of Bonhoeffer, and fascinating class. We got to dive into all of his works and, really his theology lived out, the way he did. But I remember one class in particular, because Bonhoeffer's known collectively for being a pacifist, but, he obviously got himself involved in this assassination plot, to try to take down Hitler, which backfired, went really bad. And then, kind of the aftermath of like, well, did Bonhoeffer lose his way? Was he intuitive? Did he understand a nuanced, view? And I'll never forget our professor, there's only like 8 of us in this class. And he put some quote on the screen that was basically defending why Bonhoeffer made the right call in, choosing to do what he did with Hitler. And so he puts it on the screen. He has us all look at it. And he goes, I want to go around the room and I want to hear from you guys. Like, do you agree with this quote? So I'm like second to last. He goes on the line, do you agree? Yes, 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 yes. Everybody's a yes. He gets to me and I say, no. And then he goes to the last guy and he goes, wait, did you say no? I was like, no, I don't agree with that. And he's like, what? And I had this moment where I'm like, something's wrong with me. Like everybody else can see this, but me. And I just have felt this, like there's a lonely position. I can think of few other things where you are as lonely if you say, yes, I adhere to this ideal, than saying, a pacifist. And I get all the, so you're telling me, if someone broke, all the stereotypical things. But for anybody who cares, the book that got me there is a book called A Faith Not Worth Fighting For. I don't know if you're familiar with this book.
No, I don't think I am.
It's a collection of authors. So it's not one author, but it's looking at all the reasons why people aren't nonviolent, why they're not pacifists, and then it tackles each one. And that was the book that intellectually and theologically helped me to work through it and go, no, and again, I finished the last chapter sitting in a hotel room in Knoxville, Tennessee, on a trip. And that's when I was like, shoot, I just became a pacifist. But I think it's so fascinating. And I appreciate even your transparency and the way this has been, an ongoing journey for you. And
yeah. And I think what's interesting about Bonhoeffer, I read his Ethics last summer. I tried to read a few of his works just to get to know his thought more. And he talks about like that. I think what I appreciate about him, he struggled with that ethics wasn't ultimately about principles and these like abstract rules. I mean, like that ultimately we have to make decisions in faith, risking it will sin, and trusting God's grace anyway. And so I think, maybe, it's easy historically to think, I'm sure that's what he went through when he made those decisions, because I think he did seem to be oriented towards pacifism, right? And he's trying to think in these sort of, I think that's why, and maybe I am one. I'll have to check that book out. Maybe I'll just be sitting in a coffee shop in Richmond, Kentucky, and I'll have the same story. But I guess what I liked about that is so much of ethics, like in philosophy, is about whether it's a virtue ethical approach, but in general, it's like these principles or rules or virtues and kind of clear algorithmic sorts of moral reasoning. And Bonhoeffer's wrestling with what does it mean to try to live, to follow Christ in my context? And of course, Nazism, the radical, difficult, evil context. And so how do you not become evil and yet resist evil? But the other thing too, which I've really pressed with my students, and I think that I was not aware of, as most people aren't, is just all the successful, so to speak, nonviolent movements over the centuries. I have it's about that thick, so I haven't read it, but it looks good on my shelf. A book just full of sort of historical ways, nonviolent resistance, sometimes within a nation against, a despot or unjust government, and other times in international conflict, including World War II. There are some things that people did and resisted Hitler and nonviolently, and it worked. So it sounds foolish, and I'm like, you people, so Hitler comes and you're just going to let, we'd all be speaking German and saluting the swastika now, or it's interesting. You mentioned the thing about coming home and your wife, or I mentioned that too, but Tolstoy has a great take on this. We read this with my class, and he just everybody talks about coming home and someone attacking your wife, but it never happens. Now, of course, it does happen, but his point is you're building your whole view of violence on a very rare occurrence, generally speaking, in the world. So you pump some intuitions that people have about, of course, I'd fight then, and then you open the door to, well, here's a bunch of other ways that it's justified, and then like you mentioned, you start using theology to justify what you want to do anyway, which we're all tempted to do, but man, just don't see. What the way is the way of the cross. And as a friend of mine, I think I said this in a book too. Yeah, we read it today. The way of the towel, right? The washing of feet. It's not the way of the sword.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. All right, let's get into a little philosophy. When I found out you were a professor, I got stoked because that is, I don't know if I call it a hobby. It's a love of mine in addition to other things that I read. And I would say last few years, I've been getting more and more into Stoicism and finding, a lot of really interesting ideals in Stoicism. Again, I wouldn't define myself in any philosophical terms, but I have found, probably like you, that philosophy helps me make sense of a lot of these things and have some nuanced thoughts. In your book, you talk about making a memento mori playlist. And this kind of triggered that because a lot of Stoicism talks about this idea of memento mori. And I've never heard of like a playlist. I saw that was like very morbid at first. I'll be honest. My first answer was like, oh man, that has got to be a super depressing playlist. But I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. And it's a cool application of the idea. But I'm curious, as a Christian professor of philosophy, do you find value in things like Stoicism? And if yes, how can Christians incorporate some of these ideas?
Yeah, so I absolutely do. I think, Stoicism, I hadn't really read much about it until, I knew a little bit enough to teach it for a day, that kind of thing. But I read some more of Marcus Aurelius, and who's the other big Stoic? My mind's gone blank. You probably know. There's like another. Yeah, that guy.
Seneca.
Yeah, all three of them. That's right. Thank you. Yeah. And just they remind me, like, when Christians ask about philosophy in general, for me, I think of them, Aristotle, who had some really bad things to say, but a lot of them, I think people like Aristotle, to a degree Plato, the Stoics, like some of the ancient Greeks and Stoics, they got really far, like not as far as you can get, but they got really far off of just general or natural revelation. Like these people thought about the world deeply. And yeah, there's just a Christian tradition for as far back as Christian thought goes. There's the book of the Bible, then there's the book of the world, right? So they're reading the book of world, thinking about human nature. So it is really interesting, these like Stoic practices. Some of them can become extreme, but some of them kind of fit within, a sort of a Christian spiritual disciplines kind of approach to spirituality. I would say, I think of someone like Aristotle, if you sort of set aside some of the morally objectionable stuff and just take his ideas and apply it to all humans instead of just kind of him and people like him, which is what he wanted. It's incredible, the amount of insight into human nature and how we ought to live. So I think it can be useful because if that sort of old adage that all truth is God's truth, and I find truth and I have found that in the Stoics and the ancient Greeks, that has been really helpful as I bring those things into conversation with stuff in Scripture or other Christian thought. Yeah, it does add a depth and a richness. And too, it helps me understand. So, thinking about moral development, Aristotle, basically his advice, you want to become like more virtuous, is just work hard at it. So you want to be honest, go do honest actions. And there's something to that, right? Like if you want to be good at anything, it requires time and focus and effort, whether it's learning how to, hit a 95-mile-an-hour fastball or acquire self-control. But as Christians too, then we know we're going to run into a wall because we've got this view of human nature that we can't do it on our own, right? Even if we are a noble, independently wealthy citizen of Athens, like Aristotle was, and those are the people that could be virtuous. Nobody else could for him, the males. And but yeah, if you expand it to all humans, and then we have like this, what we talked about at the start of the discussion here, this transformative union with God where things can happen that you can't explain just by your own power. And I've definitely seen that in my work, in my character, in my relationships. And of course, they're still fraught with issues, and as I am. But yeah, I think that's the benefit, is it can help you see things that you can't see, because the Bible, it's a pretty thick book that doesn't cover everything, right? And so God speaks through all kinds of ways and all kinds of people.
And I think, if all I had was Stoicism, I would probably be pretty depressed, I think, truthfully.
Yeah.
If all I had that, and I would say I found this true with like Buddhism as well, is if you use some of these ideas, they actually set up the truths of the gospel really nicely. They make you aware of human conditions in some, holistic ways, which then when you go to Jesus, you go, oh, I see a need that's being met there. And I found that with Stoicism. There's also a ton of overlap. And I'm curious if you've seen any of this, but just in my own reading recently, I was reading that when John's gospel talks about the word logos, being with God and identified with God, one of the books I was reading saying that John is borrowing Stoic philosophy here, that the logos was a very Stoic idea of understanding the creator, right? Like this logos. And then the same argument was made with the word pneuma, right? Which we use for often the Holy Spirit, the breath of God, the Spirit of God. Do you see connections there, even in language that's used in some of the Greek ideas, and then what the New Testament writers were doing?
Yeah, that logos term is, when you mentioned Stoicism, that's the first thing that jumped to mind, because I remember when I was reading through some of their things a couple of years ago, or I guess, 4 years ago now, like 2018 to 2020. Yeah, they talk about that, right? That there's this rational or logical principle, but of a divine nature. And so that same word. So I think I don't know enough about the history and the overlap, but I've heard that those claims being made. But regardless of that, they're, in terms of actual appropriating it, it makes sense. And even if he wasn't intentionally appropriating it, it's the same ideas at work to a degree, right? That at its basis, reality is, there is a rational undergirding. There is this logos, rational principle, logical, and for us, it's a person it's actually, the Trinity, persons we can interact with. So reality is at its base, both rational and relational for Christians. And I think for Stoics, it's rational. And they want to try to live their life according to the way reality is, and that's exactly, that's an exact parallel to what we're trying to do. Right.
Right.
So yeah, I think from my understanding, as I've read recently, I think there was sort of some cross-pollination there. But that just makes sense. I mentioned in the book, Dallas Willard shows up a lot. He's one person really influential in my own thinking about Christianity. Not just, a little bit philosophy, but mostly his spiritual writings. But sometime in the past month or two, I think I was watching or listening to a talk on YouTube he gave, and he said something like, it would be really surprising if God would create a world like ours and he wouldn't communicate some of his truths through other religions like Buddhism. Or it's true, why would God not work in any avenue to get to people, to reach people, to help them see reality and ultimately himself? And so I think that's something that when I was 20 no, that's not, those are all false religions, so there can't be anything good about them. You just sort of, then you realize, well, actually, a lot of them, of course, there's differences, but compassion is kind of a big deal, not just in Buddhism, but in Christianity too. So they're both places. So that's just reality, for an easy example. But yeah, I think that's really helpful too.
I had a friend ask me recently. he was saying through Jesus and, trying to make sense of Jesus. And he asked me this question. He said, do I have to be a Christian to believe in Jesus? And I thought it was such an interesting, that was really a hang up for him, because he said, I don't really want to be a Christian, the way, and he doesn't live in America, but the way he sees it and his experiences. But he's drawn to Jesus, and he wants to submit his life to Jesus. But he's going, do I have to adopt all this other stuff? And we had a fascinating conversation, very similar to this, of like, no, like follow Jesus, follow that which is true, and measure it by Jesus, and let wherever that takes you. And I said, I think there are people following Jesus in all religions of the world. And it's like, what? Like, I think there are people following Jesus in Islam. I think there are people following Jesus in Buddhism, right? And in Hinduism. Like, I think there are people trying to follow Jesus as they have experienced him. And it looks very different. If you travel, you see this of like, oh, I've met these people, and, they may not have the Christian title or moniker the way that you and I might be comfortable with, but you go, oh, they're actually trying to follow the same person. And it is very interesting to take a step back and go, all right, what is actually pointing us to truth and to God here?
Yeah. I think I always get these guys mixed up. I think it's Frank Laubach. He was like, and I read some of his spiritual writings recently, and he talked like he was a missionary, but like lived in a Muslim nation and did a lot for literacy. But he talked about how his spiritual life was helped so much by, in a sense, practicing Islam, that when the call to prayer came out, and his he would engage in prayer as a Christian, but he just talked about like the discipline and the faithfulness and some of those things that so rather than just sort of that knee-jerk reaction, it's like God's grace, God's truth present all kinds of places that you wouldn't expect, like carpenter's son from ancient Near East 2,000 years ago, that kind of stuff. So, which is one of the things I've liked about Christianity over the years. Is, you wouldn't expect it to be that guy. Shouldn't he like shown up in Athens and like just wowed everybody with his views about the good life, and Aristotle bow down and worship? Like, there's a part of me that would be way cooler than also, and like actually kind of like it fits the humility, right? It came in this time and a place that was not expected for the Messiah. So you wouldn't expect the King of Kings to show up. So, and rule in a different way. And this goes back to the pacifism thing, right? His kingdom is a lot different than the kingdoms of the world. And those things are built on violence or the threat of it. And his is built on, well, as I argue in the book, humility and love. So, and I'm just arguing from what I think, it's not my original argument. It's kind of in the New Testament and in these great Christian thinkers over the centuries. Yeah. So it's really good. And God's humble enough to work through those means. Right? It doesn't have to be the official Christian means.
All right, let's lighten this up a little bit. We're getting too heady with theology, the philosophy. So here's a question I love asking people. This is a totally different gear. What is if you think about enjoying a glass of wine, and what I've gotten all different answers to this question. Is there a moment, if you think back and I go, what's the best glass of wine you've ever had, where you think of it was that moment with that person, or maybe you think of a bottle, maybe you think of a location, whatever. Do you have anything that comes to mind that you go, that was it for me, and we'd love to hear about it?
Yeah. I don't even remember I know it was a Cabernet Sauvignon. I don't remember what it was, but I was in grad school at University of Colorado in Boulder. So all our kids were like elementary or preschool age, but it was just an anniversary, and my wife and I like shared a bottle of wine. I just remember that night, like just the celebration, and like when you've got young kids, the freedom of when they're all finally in bed and asleep. We may have gone out for dinner. I don't even think we did. It was probably one of those nights we just stayed in, made dinner, and so. I'm sure it was like a $20 bottle of wine, no incredible thing, but it was more about the occasion, who I shared it with, and that it was tastes good, and we enjoyed it. Right? It was just one of those fun nights. So
that's great. Yeah. Okay, you talk about in the book that you've changed your posture on social media since 2015, and as I thought about a book that's helping people practically look more like Jesus. The way we use social media probably should be a key part of this discussion. Any insights that you can share with people? What has it meant for you to change your posture on social media?
Yeah. So one, and I kind of realized this in retrospect, I stopped expecting people to like have conversations there unless I know them for the purpose of like engaging each other and trying to figure out what's true. Like it's more of a dumpster fire, right? Especially with strangers. So when I'm trying to ask a question or say something and somebody just comes back with an insult, I don't think I would never insult people back, but I just would engage them and try to like, I don't know if I was trying to make them engage me authentically, but I guess in a way I was, instead of just like, okay. And I kind of changed when somebody does that. I'm going to say, okay, have a nice day or nice night. That's sort of I'm out. But I think for me, it's realizing that it has to do with this stuff. So I tried to, what does it mean to do this? Like, how would Jesus engage? I don't think he'd ignore it. I don't think he would spend a ton of time on it because, just the relational part, or just the face-to-face is so much better than anything mediated through a screen. But, to be curious with people I disagree with, or if someone's just going to be a troll, like there's actually, like, just listen to somebody talk about this psychologically, don't interact with them. You're just giving them what they want. And actually if it's, a sibling in Christ and they're doing that, I'm actually like a stumbling block to them by keeping engaging, right? Because that's not what they want to do. So I've tried to like be firm and say what I think and why, but with people that disagree with me, not just about like sort of Trump and politics stuff, because I was just this is not a good idea from the start. And I never really talked about politics online before, but I was just like, I just can't handle what's happening. And 9 years later, and here we go again. But for me, it's like being curious, right? So this is one of those things that has stuck with me. This was actually on Twitter several years ago. I don't even know how I got in this conversation back and forth, but it was a woman who was gay, and people were kind of attacking her, and other people were defending her. And I just said, I'm a Christian, kind of evangelical background, but I'm just sorry the way that you've been treated and the way the church has treated you. And her response back, and you could feel the honesty and through it, was like, no one has ever said that to me before. Like, no Christian has ever just apologized for the ways that I've been treated in my community. And so, yeah, just to see someone as a person, and coming to realize too, a lot of people that I've had, people who have sort of, I guess, people that I know or have mutual acquaintances who are really attack oriented, and I guess I would just say are jerks, online to me and to other people. And I stop engaging, but also as I start knowing some of their backstories, I'm not excusing this because I think we're all still responsible for who we are and how we act, but a lot of them are just have gone through difficult stuff, or just they're acting out rather than processing their pain or their disappointment or whatever it is. They're just like venting it in those ways. It's so easy to do. So trying to engage people with questions, trying to engage rather than sort of face to face, we're opponents. Let's engage shoulder to shoulder, looking out, trying to figure out what's true together. And if somebody doesn't want to do that, that's fine, but I'm not going to keep engaging them, because then it really is, not only is there no good point, there's a lot of like bad things that happen as a result of that. And because, man, just the way I'm built, because I would never like say things like that to people. When people do it to me, I'm just like, it starts churning for like a day. And I'm just like, I don't need to be obsessed about some random person on social media that I barely know or that I don't know at all in real life. But that's just not a good use of my emotional energy. So I've learned to disengage, but to engage, really just trying to do this, engage in humility and love. And what does that look like here? Stopping and thinking about that, which means a lot of times I just don't engage at all. Other times I might ask a question, or especially with other Christian philosophers, I'll challenge them, but try to do it in a non-confrontational way, by asking questions, and not like the obnoxious question that's not a question, but like really asking the question because I want to know what they think. A question that's really kind of a insult, or just setting myself up to
How
to
stupid
go for the
are you?
jugular. Yeah, I thought you're smart. You're a philosopher. I guess not.
Yeah, that's great. All right,
I guess you're not really. Yeah. Let's do that. Let's go.
Some quick questions to get your take on. What's something that's blowing your mind right now?
That is a good question. I'm trying to think of a light one. I mean, okay. I already mentioned this. So it is blowing my mind that it's Trump versus Biden again. Nobody says that we're happy, but it's really blowing my mind that so many really it's white evangelicals, they could have picked a number of other conservative people, and it's not a hold your nose thing. It's like, we're all in with this guy. This is our guy. That blows my mind. I still can't wrap my mind around that. And I know there are historical and sociological explanations, but when I think about the way of Jesus and the way of Trump, both as a person and just sort of all that stuff, it blows my mind that people I've heard people say you're morally obligated to vote for this guy if you're a Christian, and that blows my freaking mind. Because I just can't wrap my mind around it. And I'm not like I'm actually a registered independent, because I've been registered Republican, Democrat, so I'm not like I've voted for people on both and even third party since 1988, my first election. So I'm not sort of a partisan person in that way. But this is just one of those cases where, just it's mind-boggling. So,
what do you see as the main issues facing Christianity in America today?
I think there is sort of this boiling point of what does it look like to engage in America from our faith in the political realm. And even as much as I just want to, and I could do that because of who I am, I could ignore politics and it wouldn't really affect me. Life goes pretty well for me. Got a good job. I'm not rich, but I'm not worried about making my house payment. 53 or 54-year-old white guy, I'm not really worried about a lot of things in our society. Is kind of set up for me in certain ways. But tell me the question again. I'm starting to get concerned about my brain, but yeah, I get my thoughts. I get over my skis, and then I can't remember what the question was. So repeat it for me. I'm sorry.
Main issues facing Christianity
the church,
in America.
Yeah. So that thing, what is the vision of? What does it mean to that line in the Lord's Prayer? Your will be done, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What does that mean for Christians in the political realm? Because I'm 100% like all the way convinced it's not a Christian nationalism, a coercive use of the state. I'm also not convinced of sort of the Anabaptist approach, even though there's a part of me that's drawn to that. Like, I think that what is that going to look like? And not just politically, but just more broadly culturally. How are we going to, are we just going to keep doing this culture war stuff that we've done since the 70s, but for sure the 80s and 90s, where there's just and it's a lot quicker, I mentioned this in the book, right? It was relativism, postmodernism, then it was the emergent church, and then it just speeds up. It's CRT, it's wokeism, it's progressive Christianity. It's like, oh my gosh, what are we for? Instead of, everybody's worried this is like going to take down our country or the church. And first of all, I don't know. The empires fall sooner or later. America will probably fall, hopefully much later than sooner, given the good things about it. But the church, we're kind of told the church isn't going to fail. So I think, what does it look like to engage with people we disagree with on fundamental moral and political issues in ways that reflect the love of Christ? And that to me is the pressing issue, because so many people are leaving the faith, and they're leaving a faith they're leaving a Jesus that I don't think is the real Jesus. And so we need to give people that Jesus, or prepare the way to the way, so to speak, using the language of the book. That to me is what sticks out. And part of that's because of what I do and who I am, but it sure seems like that dominates when you ask people about Christianity or certain kinds of Christianity in America. For so many, that's what comes to mind, and it shouldn't be that. It should be something else.
What's a problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah. Problem I'm trying to solve. I think in my own life, sort of the continued faithfulness, right, to the way in the midst of, like, there are times where I mentioned this earlier, where you just think, is this really true? And I still make my choices as if it is, but it's sort of like, how do you live in that gray area of, like, I believe, kind of the I believe, help my unbelief sort of thing. And that I'm just not getting my way in certain parts of my life, and that's okay. Right? That's a big part of the spiritual life, is not having to get my way. But then more broadly, I am trying to, like, contribute to solving this sort of politics thing in our country. And the nationalism, the Christian nationalism thing, it doesn't seem to be going away, and it seems to be gaining a bit of traction, at least on certain parts of it. And yeah, so I'm trying to, like, both speaking and writing, trying to, like, say, look, this is for sure not the way of Jesus. And I've read some of the books by these guys, and they're awful in terms of, like, what they're calling for. So I'm trying to push back against that co-opting of Christian language and symbols and faith.
Yeah. What's something you're excited about right now?
That the Kansas City Chiefs could three-peat the Super Bowl. I'm like this is the worst ever. So, I mean, for me, like, I grew up in Kansas City. I still remember being at Arrowhead Stadium probably in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was 3rd and 56. Like, I remember that because I just remember it, 3rd and they were horrible for so many years. Like, and then good enough to make the playoffs, but never really make it all the way. And so I actually am excited about that, because it's not just the team. It's like all that means kind of my hometown where I'm from. But yeah, it's funny. So I'm a Chiefs fan because I grew up in Kansas City. I got my PhD in Boulder. So I walk into the grocery store here in Richmond, Kentucky in the fall, and there's like Travis Kelce t-shirt and like some CU Boulder thing because of Deion Sanders. I'm just like, I'm not a bandwagoner. Like, these are like, I have loyalties here that predate, Taylor Swift and Deion Sanders. So,
you and everyone else.
Yeah, that's right. So, but yeah, it is pretty funny though, because I'll walk around with my Chiefs stuff and, like, I just want to say, no, I've suffered for decades. I deserve this joy.
That's the real fans. Like, look, I've been through it. I need this.
Yeah. That's right. I'm going to ride it out while I can until Mahomes is done, and then, go back to mediocrity, but that's okay.
There you go. Well, Mike, is there anything else you'd like to add that I have not asked you about?
That's a good question. I think I would like to add that in the midst of this stuff, because there's in the book and in some of my other work, like, I'm really focused in on character development and spiritual formation, how those two things go together. That's what this book is, and I'm trying to work on some other stuff. But in speaking to myself and others who have that bent, I think sometimes we can be like overly harsh or self-critical. Like, some people are way too easy on themselves. I tend to be personality-wise too harsh on myself. And so I want to say that all this stuff, rediscovering the way, trying to grow in humility and love, seek out God, transformative union, all of it, like, it just has to be permeated through and through with grace and mercy. And that if I'm more humble or loving in a year than I am today, it doesn't change God's love for me like one iota, right? That's the through line. So I think that's what I want to say, because it's so easy to talk about this stuff, and then you can kind of get lost that it all happens in the midst of this, sort of the father of the prodigal son welcoming us back, no matter where we've gone, what we've done.
Love it. Well, hey, guys, you can check out Mike's new book, Humility. You can get this, anywhere books are sold, I'm assuming. The website, if you want to find out more about what Mike's doing, is michaelwaustin.com. I just want to say I have appreciated, I think you're our first philosophy professor on the podcast. I love what you're doing. I love the arena in which you're doing it. Grateful for your book. We need more encouragement for people like, hey, let's actually do this stuff. Let's actually look more like Jesus. And obviously, as you write, humility is a great way to unpack that and to focus on that. And so I'm grateful for this. Thank you for taking the time to talk more about these ideas with us and explore with us and drinking some nice wine with us. We really appreciate all that you're doing for the kingdom, but obviously just for us as well. So thanks for taking the time today, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciated it and enjoyed the discussion.
Awesome. All right, everybody. We will catch you on the next episode of Cabernet and Pray. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for Cabernet and Pray. We'd love to hear what you thought of today's episode or what you'd like to see more of in the future. You can email us at cheers@communionwineco.com. And if you like this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us online at communionwineco.com.